right. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Addy, for putting this together. And I'm excited to talk to you guys today about questions in the classroom. And I titled this workshop, Asking Meaningful Questions That Elicit Evocative Responses. And I like this title. Let's see here. What did I want to talk about? Questions. First, I wanted to start with some questions about you guys. Jessica, tell me why you chose to attend this workshop.
I'm just always trying to figure out ways to get more engagement in my classes. I teach really large lecture sections as a gen ed statistics course. So I have 90 students in a classroom and a really, really broad range of abilities for the, like affinity for the subject, and then also study abilities and like levels of just motivation in school. So, trying to figure out ways to make my class more interesting for the average person out there. So I come to as many of these CTE events that I can.
That's awesome. Thank you. And how about you, Elias? What brought you here?
Similar to Jessica, I just want to broaden my perspective, and I get working in my own classroom with my own students for so long. I just like to hear from others and to just have a fresh set of eyes and some additional insight that would help me grow and broaden what I can bring to the classroom to invite conversation, invite further dialogue, invite deeper reflection.
Thank you. And what do you teach, and what kind of classes do you teach? Are they large, small?
Fairly small. Typical classroom size is between 7 and 20.
And what subject?
Yeah, I teach theology, pastoral care. So I'm at Perkins.
Okay, that's awesome. And Matt, what brought you here? Oh no, Matt, Mark. Sorry, I apologize.
I would think you know who I am, since I'm apparently your
I would
avatar.
think so too.
I'm your avatar we learned in the last workshop. So yeah, I just try to come to the CT stuff when I can and support CT and what they're doing, and I usually learn interesting things. And slight shout out to myself that next week I'm presenting on peer feedback, and I thought there might be some stuff in here that kind of relates to that. So I wanted to know what Constantine was talking about, and if I can bring any of that into next week's workshop, do that.
Okay, that's very cool. All right, well, thank you. I hope this will be somewhat interesting, and it will provide some information about questions and how to form them, question types, and what kind of questions are more useful for what situations. I usually teach smaller classes, at most 20 students, so we get a lot more chance of deeper conversation, and this workshop is meant more in that direction. I don't know how to engage really large groups outside of more automated type systems, where you have kind of games and phone things where you have them participate through those, or you could split your classes in multiple smaller sections and then have interviews that way. But I haven't taught very many, if any. I'm trying to think if I taught any really large classes, not interactive classes. So I don't know how that's going to work. So that will be very interesting in the last part of the workshop to discuss some of your strategies. Yes, Mark.
Just on that note, just a comment to Jessica teaching the much larger classes. And I'm also teach small classes. Addie, you're gonna, oh my God, I just blanked on your name. Jill DeTemple did a workshop over the winter break on the dialogic classroom, I think was the name of it. Anyway, but you might want to talk with her about this topic too, because I thought she had some interesting ideas for that. And even in that workshop, it was a fairly large group and found ways to get those sort of evocative answers and stuff in different ways, including going and doing like some small group stuff where you shared with those, and then those kind of came back to the big groups. There were some useful strategies she had from that workshop I would recommend.
Yes, and I am going to bring some of her work into this. Not, to her extent, obviously, but just a little bit, because I did think that her way of doing questions was very interesting. Okay, so this session focuses on techniques of creating meaningful conversations with your students by asking questions in a way that elicit complex and rewarding answers. So this is a little bit about me. Actually, I'm not in the picture, but you can see part of my family. It's not all. It's a fairly large family that I have, but those are some of my children, and I like them. I am Constantine Iclanu. I got my PhD from right here at the University of Kentucky, and it is in Spanish, literature and film is what I study, mostly related to immigration. So that's a little bit about me. I'm a lecturer of Spanish at SMU, and I do all sorts of other things. Let's see here. I wanted to read to you this little quote because I think it's pretty good, by John Dewey. It says, "When a question is properly posed, the problem is nearly solved." I just thought it fit pretty well with what we're doing. So questions are tools. Questions help us achieve certain goals, right? So these are some of the questions that you have to think about as a good instructor. Is the pedagogy, right? What are you trying to get out of your students? What do you want more from them? What kind of strategies are you using as you're asking questions, and how do your students usually respond to your questions, right? Do the answers work with what you're looking for? And why do you think this is so? So I'm going to actually ask you this, which is, what are you trying to get out of your students? Just more participation or more interest? What is it that you want to achieve? Does anybody want to pick this up?
I'll talk. For me, I'm trying to shift my students toward active learning instead of passive learning, since I do have a large lecture. And I've tried to move in that direction. I have moved in that direction this term with doing think, pair, share for the first time. I've never done that in a big lecture before. And it helps, but it does slow down the class. And so we're struggling, I guess, to finish the content before the end of the term. So that's creating some new issues. But I do find that if I don't do that, if I just try to go through it from the front and say, okay, what comes next, then what happens is the same students every time answer the questions, and it's the very confident students who know what's happening. And that's not a good way for me to assess if the class as a whole understands, to gauge, are we tracking together? Are we ready to move on? So I really want to shift away from this just kind of, I pose something to the group and see who answers, and instead more have them working hard on either on their own or with a group, and then they come back to the class, so that I can get more broad participation from each student in the room.
Yeah, I think in those larger classes, you may want to try some sort of polling solutions. Nearpod has some things like this.
Yeah.
There are a variety of different electronic tools where you can have your students use their cell phones in class.
Yes.
And you ask a question, and then you can even set them in groups,
Yes.
and where you've got smaller groups, and then each group can come together with one answer, and then you get all the answers. And I believe they even auto-populate in like your PowerPoint. They'll just appear. You'll have to be somewhat careful with that because you can get some interesting answers sometimes. But people, specifically if you take away anonymity, then they'll be less inclined to write things that are off. So I think
absolutely already use that stuff, but that's more like a quantitative or it's like multiple choice even. And my class is a lot more critical thinking and logical explanation. So I still the polling software cannot replicate that dialogue of explaining a thought process. So that's what I'm trying to get more of in my classroom.
Okay, very good. Anybody else? What else are you trying to get out of your students, and it's not coming out, or it's a little bit more difficult?
I don't know if this is evocative, but usually the specific thing I'm struggling at with questions and student responses is if we're critiquing work they teach in an art program, and getting them to look beyond the more obvious things to the sort of deeper things. So like as an example, everyone loves to point out when a shot was out of focus, or I didn't like the lighting in that, and we'll like completely miss but the story didn't make any sense in the first place. Like there's a bigger structural problem here regardless of the shooting. And so getting them to that deeper level is something that sometimes is a struggle.
Good. Thank you for sharing that. I think we're going to cover this thing called funnel questions, and that may be something that you can apply with your students. Anybody else?
If I want, I just came, so I don't know. This is the first slide, right?
Yes.
Very important thing I like to get from my students in language class is motivation. I see 15 students in front of me. My goal is thinking how many of them I'm gonna get to sign up in second year, right? So I try to come up with something cool. I expect them don't know a piece of history, a piece of language, a piece of language information, or historical information, or something they did not think of, but it was obvious all the time before their eyes or their life. And maybe one of them or two will be kind of inside them to think, oh, this is cool. Maybe start thinking about it, and decide to continue over time. So, with the repetition of this strategy, maybe they're gonna be excited to discover more things like that. And and this is like one of the main things I also struggle with.
Yeah, I know you know what you're doing, so I'm sure you do a great job in your classes. I think culture is the thing that attracts students most, that want to continue. So I would find things about the cultures you're teaching to entice the students so that they want more of it. Questions and discussions are obviously the way to go, depending on their level and their ability to discuss in the language. And sometimes you may want to discuss in English if your goal is retention and excitement rather than language practice. So that may be something to think about. Okay, well, thank you guys for your participation. So why questions? And here's some thoughts I had, and I researched. Questions can diagnose student understanding of material. So these are comprehension checks. Questions are a way of engaging with students to keep their attention and to reinforce their participation. We want participation, and I was thinking about this, like, why is it that we want participation? Is it just so we don't hear ourselves talk for too long, and right? But we want participation because it helps the student retain more. It helps us understand our students' motivations and goals, and us in hearing their answers and listening to their answers, we then model and create our curricula in such a way to attract, retain, and make them more excited about what we teach. That hopefully will turn them into minors or majors or whatever. Questions can review, restate, emphasize, or summarize what is important, right? So we can even delve deeper, right? As you see in the next one, they can stimulate discussion and creative and critical thinking, as well as determine how students are thinking in the moment, right? You may take your students from whatever topic. Let's say a student talks about the camera is not focused on one instance, but you want them to focus somewhere else. You can use questions to ask for further information or to guide the discussion towards what you're looking for rather than what the student has seen. But it is always important to acknowledge what they're seeing and then ask a follow-up question to dig deeper. And then lastly, questions help students retain material by putting into words otherwise unarticulated thoughts. There's a saying that says that the teacher learns more about the subject they're teaching than anybody else because they are involved with it. They're thinking about it. They're practicing it ahead of time. If we can get our students to participate in the creation of the curricula with questions, and we take seriously their questions, then they feel ownership and they will retain more and they'll participate more because they feel that they're co-creators with you in the course. Good. Now, forming questions. I'm sure you've all seen this, the Bloom's taxonomy. This is a fantastic way of thinking of how and what kind of questions I want to ask in my class. And again, all these have a point and they mean things. It just depends on what you are interested pedagogically to achieve. If you want your students to remember things, then you can ask questions. And I recommend you all search Bloom's taxonomy. It will come with charts full of words that evoke remembering. And I'm going to see if I actually have this ready because I believe that I saved this too. Give me just 1 second. Not this one, this one. Okay, let me reshare my screen for just a second so you can see. So for example, if we are looking at, we want to create questions that evoke remembering or understanding or applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, we can use these kinds of words in here, which are the Bloom's taxonomy's keywords, to then come up with questions that address a certain point of what we want. So for example, if we're wanting them to analyze something, we can tell them to compare and contrast the different shots in the said film beyond the lack of focus in that scene, right? So that way, because I'm using these words, create and contrast, their answers that will be given back to us will be used to analyze something. We can evaluate or, and we can use some of these words like conclude what is most important from the scene you just watched, right? This one, we are evaluating, we have to use a different kind of an answer in responding to the question that the professor has asked. So I really recommend you guys take some time. If you're not familiar with this, I am very familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, but I cannot say that I remember all these words. So every time I need to create questions, I usually have these guys open on a side and I look at them, and that's how I come up with questions for my courses, specifically in the design stage. Like when I'm creating a new course, I always have this up. And as I'm creating my slides and my course objectives and modules objectives, I'll be using some of these questions to take my students from a basic understanding to a more analyzing, evaluating, and creating as I go through a specific task of the class, right? We definitely want them to remember and understand, but we really want them to apply and analyze, evaluate, and if possible, and it makes sense in the course, create with it. So it is very important to, again, take your students, use some of these keywords in your questions to move them from different kinds of understanding onto another. Good. Okay, these are questions that you should think about as you are creating your questions for your students, as you are creating your class plans. Does this question draw out and work with pre-existing understanding that students bring with them? Many times questions that are not the best kind of questions ask things that students are unfamiliar with. And there is a place for those kinds of questions, but most often in an education class or a class that tries to teach something, our questions should be leading, meaning they should have a purpose, and that purpose is usually something that is either recall, apply, analyze, right? And with that, we should ask questions where the students have some knowledge, and then we want to expand based on their knowledge. We evaluate what they've told us, and then we apply those things and we build upon them with other kinds of questions to help them progress on this Bloom's taxonomy scale. Does this question raise the visibility of the key concepts the students are learning? Right, I'm going to pick again on that same film question. The student says, I've seen that the cameras are the focus, and you're like, excellent, that is a very good observation. Now, will you please also analyze the purpose of this out of focus camera in relation to the theme of the film, or something like that, where we've acknowledged, we've listened, we've accepted, and now we are adding to the questions in order to get the students towards a higher level of thinking from simply understanding, meaning seeing it, to a more analysis or evaluating type attitude. Will this question stimulate peer discussion, right? So I remember when I was a grad student and I was a TA here at the University of Kentucky, they would ask us to create lesson plans, and we would have to show them to our supervisor before we taught. And I remember how annoyed I was with that. I was like, why do I have to make these lesson plans? I know what I'm teaching. I'm teaching X about Spanish, I don't know, preterite tense. I know what I'm teaching. I know how to teach it. Why do I have to create class objectives or, say those kinds of more mechanical things? But they really do make sense. They slow things down, but they help us where our classes drive always to a point that we want to make, rather than we're just expounding information and we just hope that the students will get it, right? When we have clear objectives that we're shooting for, we will achieve them, right? So this question, will this question stimulate peer discussion as you're creating your lesson plans and your PowerPoints or whatever else you're doing to, do your lessons? You should ask yourself those questions. I want more from my students in X way. Then how am I applying that? How am I getting to that with my discussion points? And I was thinking earlier about what you said, Jessica, about not getting to all your content in your class. And from my perspective, I think that that's less important to get through the material. What's more important is that the discussions are meaningful and the students know what they need to cover in their asynchronous study, right? They study at home all these things, and then you cherry pick the most important points where you don't have to re-lecture the same things that they've already learned, but rather you focus on what you find most important or what you think is most important for them to remember. And then past that, apply, analyze, evaluate. Good. Is it clear what the question is about? And this is really hard, because sometimes we get in our mind and we're like, I already know all this stuff. I know exactly what I'm teaching, how I'm supposed to teach it. But oftentimes we don't ask us this self-evaluating question is, are my questions clear? Sometimes we ask a question that has multiple elements in it, like multiple questions within the same question, and the students don't even know where to start or what to answer. And if you've all been, and I'm sure you all have been to academic conferences where people present on something and then somebody in the audience is like, I have a question, and they talk for like 10 minutes, and you're like, I don't even know where to begin answering what you just said, because you've asked like 20 questions and you've given a speech. So make sure when you ask questions, the questions are simple, they're understandable, they build upon each other, and they drive to a pedagogical point. Good. Okay, question types. We're going to go through this fairly fast. So we've got closed-ended questions, and we're going to talk in detail about each one of these. We've got open-ended questions, we've got funnel questions, probing questions, dialogical questions, which is what you had brought up, Mark. And now let's get into these. Closed-ended questions. Does anybody know what these are? I just asked the closed-ended question. Do you know what this is? Yes. Right. Closed-ended questions are yes or no answers. They're binary in the way that you form a question and they're meant to get a simple answer, comprehension checks, and such things, right? So here's some question samples. Do you know who, I don't know, the president is? You can't answer something very complex there. You would say, oh, it's President Biden, or somebody else if you think that they're still president. Have you eaten authentic brisket, Texas brisket? Yes or no, right? These are closed-ended questions. Is it true that, whatever it may be, right? These are closed-ended questions. Now, is there ever a time when these closed-ended questions are useful to us as instructors? What do you guys think? I see a nod here and there. Addie, why are these questions useful?
If you just want a knowledge check, a quick knowledge check, you're not stimulating dialogue from it, but you can just, I feel like these could even be something like raising a hand too, right? Like you're not elaborating on the answer, but you just want to get a quick check if they're getting something.
Yeah, exactly.
There is a function.
They could be a thumbs up, thumbs down, middle thumbs. You could create all sorts of systems when your class to quickly poll your students about all sorts of things. They do have a point. In the language classrooms, I always tell my students to avoid these questions or to use them as a starting point of a conversation, but to make sure that if a question can be simply answered a yes or no, in the context of a larger conversation, they're not asking the right questions. However, they do have a point in our classrooms as comprehension checks, right? So you can use them as polls, yes or no answers, checking for understanding, frame setting, etc. Good. Open-ended questions. Do you like open-ended questions? I'm asking a closed-ended question. Why? Why are these questions better? That is an open-ended question, right? So usually you'll start a conversation with closed-ended questions. So you get them thinking, simple answer. Then you ask a why or a how or something like that, where you're getting deeper kinds of meaning, right? So here's some question samples: why, how. These will evoke responses that cannot simply be answered with a yes or a no. These can also be tacked on to simpler questions. Like, for example, the first question, who is the president of the United States? And somebody answers with, a few words, President Biden, and then you say, why or how does that happen, right? So we've asked a simple question, closed-ended, you add a why or a how, or give me more detail, or whatever it may be, then that forces the student to expand upon their basic answers that they're giving. Good. So can anybody think of some advantages or disadvantages of using open-ended questions? Generally, for me, I see many advantages and not so many disadvantages, but I'm just curious what you guys think. So again, open-ended questions, you can't answer them with a yes or no. You have to explain more.
I have one disadvantage, right? Like it requires more time out of the class, right? So that would be the primary disadvantage, is you have to allocate time. That means that you're taking time away from potentially just lecturing on and sharing content. But I think the advantage is that you're probing the student, that you're activating the student to actually share their thoughts, which ultimately it's engagement, right? We want to engage them.
And again, this is all about what you're looking for as an instructor in your class. If you want to spend more time because you want to dig deeper, then this is the way to do it. If you're absolutely not interested and you just want a quick comprehension check and you need to move on, then you definitely don't want to be asking why and how questions, because then you're going to get why and how answers that you don't want to hear because that's not what you want to do. Good. So
I would say,
go ahead.
sorry. I was going to say, I think another potential disadvantage is you have to be more careful in what the specific question is, because if it's like too broad, then students can come up with all sorts of things that might lead you in weird tangents and aren't getting to the material of the question you really want to ask. So it's not an inherent disadvantage, but I think you have to be more careful with what you ask.
Absolutely. No, completely accurate. And I agree with it fully, right? Open-ended questions can take us on all sorts of side paths that we may not want, but oftentimes that happens when our questions are not specific enough. Anybody else wants to respond to this, or should we continue? All right, so disadvantages, they could be too broad, right? If the question is too broad, then it's not a good question because you are not achieving what you want to say. So you may want to think about focusing your questions. Maybe the question is too complicated, right? Instead of one question, we've asked 3 questions and the students don't know how to answer. Sometimes it may take too much time. The questions could be confusing, right? And open-ended questions tend to be more of these than closed-ended questions. Advantages, we're getting critical thinking. And I think that's something that we all want from our students, regardless of what we're teaching. And open-ended questions allow our students to show us that they're thinking critically. You can get complex answers, which again, depending on what we want pedagogically from our class, may be exactly what we want or not what we want. They also show processes, usually the how question. How did the director put together the scene? What elements of cinematography were used? I've asked 2 questions there. I should have asked only 1 question, but in the how question, a student has to go through a certain process that gives us a lot more understanding of what they understand, what we need to cover better, and how something works. So those are open-ended questions. Here's some things to think about. Ask why questions when you expect your students to be familiar with a topic previously studied. Why questions can lead to overly vague or circular answers if the students have not been previously prepped. Examples, why do you, so this is a personal response, or maybe you want to say, why does some authoritative figure or institution or government or country or whatever you may want to ask here, think that whatever it may be, right? So this is an example of a why. How questions, ask how questions when you want to find out students thinking through a problem. So the process, the phenomenon, the process becomes the object of the study. How questions can expose previous learning as well as the thinking process of a student in a given situation. Example, how do you think or again, the figure institution would solve the immigration situation at the border? What steps would you take to something? What is the process you would go through to achieve such a change, right? So in this way, we're taking how questions, which are the steps involved in something, and we're applying them to whatever subject we're teaching. Funnel questions. These are some of my favorite ways of thinking about questions in the classroom. And this is what a funnel question is. So asking funnel questions is a method of drilling down into the subject, starting with closed-ended questions and then asking increasingly broader or more complex and adding more detail in each step of the conversation. So funnel questions are conversation. They elicit conversation rather than one topic with one question. They build upon each other. Okay, so here are some examples. Do you approve of President Biden's handling of the immigration at the border with Mexico? This is a closed-ended question. It's a yes or a no. Whoever was unfortunate enough to answer this question, then you would ask a follow-up question. Why do you think he has upheld Title 42 that the former president spearheaded, right? So here we're asking for some reasoning. We're still on the same topic. We've taken a closed-ended question, and now we're expanding. We're asking for reasons and open-ended with why. How do you think he, the president, should treat the people looking for asylum? Now we're asking for a process. So we're asked for reasoning. Now we're asking for a process of what should happen. Then can you give me more details about? Asking for details are part of follow-up questions, which we'll address in just a second. When you've asked a how or a why, oftentimes the answers will be fairly simple and not complex enough. And if you know that the student has it in them to give you more, or you expect more, then ask follow-up questions, asking for details, where you say, can you give me more examples? Or can you think more? Can you give me another example of a similar situation? In asking those follow-up questions, we force our students to give us more fully fledged answers rather than a quick thing that it comes to everybody's mind immediately. How would you feel as an immigrant if you were in their place and tried to enter the US? Here we are evoking empathy, and we are putting the students in the shoes of this immigrant to understand, to try to help them understand how a person on the other side of this debate, or whatever it may be that we're talking about, would possibly feel. In asking this question, you're not asking to change their answers, but you're asking them to analyze what would happen if those answers that they gave earlier would be applied to them rather than to another. What do you think you can do to influence the government's policies? Here we're asking a ton of stuff, right? This is the creative process where we've moved on the Bloom's taxonomy right from simple understanding, and I cannot see my mouse whatsoever, so I have no idea what I'm pointing at. From understanding all the way to analysis, and now to creation. So this is what a funnel question is, and these are, I find, to be the most important kinds of questions we can ask our students to create. So if you have a larger class, you can have them think about these, write them, and then ask either in a small group or just in partners, build a set of funnel questions, and then see what kind of answers you've gotten. And you can check, you can walk around the class, listen to what they're saying, and figure out how you can help them. But I think if you're to learn anything from here, this is probably the most important, is the how to build a set of questions from very simple and moving up the Bloom's taxonomy to something more complex that the students answer. And what's interesting about this kind of questions is because it builds on the same topic, the student already has the basis of what they're talking about. So it's not the first thing you ask is the last question. What do you think you can do to influence the government's policies? Whoa, what are we even talking about, right? It's way too much, way too early. But if you've gone through all the questions one by one and you've built upon that point, then this makes sense and it will give you much better answers. You can ask probing questions, which are the follow-up questions or asking for details, right? So probing questions are an effective means to get more detail and drill deeper into an answer that initially may not be fully satisfactory or leaves avenues unprobed. Examples, instructor, why do you think doing research with peer-reviewed sources is superior to Google search? Student, peer-reviewed sources are more detailed, right? It's a fine answer. But you probably want more, right? Can you give me an example when a peer review source has helped you more than one of your papers than a Google search? Student answers whatever they answer. You can ask more if you thought that maybe that wasn't enough either. Can you explain this with more details or provide another example, right? So this is how you're asking probing questions. They're similar in some way to the funnel questions, but they just ask for more details on the same level on Bloom's taxonomy, while the funnel questions take you from a lower level all the way to the highest kind of level, or wherever you want to take your students in the questioning. Among the last things we'll talk about today are the dialogic or reflective questions. That's how I like to think of them, because dialogic didn't make much sense to me in understanding what they actually meant. And this is coming from a handout that she gave to us. So I'm going to read some of it. So at times, instructors want to ask students reflective questions that can open a discussion with the class on current events that may be related to the coursework. So dialogic or reflective conversations can be an effective way to discuss sensitive topics while avoiding ideological sinkholes. So the goal here is to say, I teach about film about immigration, and they recently a boat full of immigrants sank, and I don't know, 20 bodies were found on the beaches of Spain. This just happens. It's a troubling thing that some people may be really hardened about and say, oh, it's their fault. Why are they even coming to our country? They don't have papers, blah, blah, blah. And other people may be really affected by, maybe some of their family members did something similar, or some of their friends, or who knows what, and they may be affected in a way that when presented with these facts, you can get very problematic answers that may offend other students in the class or may be very troubling. This dialogic way of doing these kinds of explorations of current events is a good way to avoid, and the way they do it, and I'll explain just a little bit, but there's so much more here. There's no time for this fully. You can ask questions that are asked in such a way that they try to avoid these, I'm on X side or on the other. Okay, so here are some means to elicit dialogic conversations. You can pause and reflect, or journaling. So when you show some current event like this that is troubling, do not ask your students to intervene or share their opinions right away. Maybe you can ask them to reflect on a piece of paper, or ask them at the end of the class, show something like this and say, now that you have seen this, and we have also learned about the troubles that immigrants go through, or human whatever standards and laws and other things, how do you apply the class learning in comparison to real events that are happening to real people? You can have students write down curious questions. Curious questions are non-ideological, meaning step away from what some TV show would ask, but rather think about me personally. What questions do I have if I were to go on that beach and find those bodies or something? Right? What questions do I have about this issue? So that way you're asking your students to step away from the expected answers and the things that come closest to us, because our culture has conditioned us to those kinds of questions, and ask deeper questions that have meaning to us personally. You can have an exit ticket to synthesize a major theme, and obviously the enduring question that are related to these more troubling facets of our planetary life. And this continues. Here are some questions to ask after these prompts. So what I showed you earlier, these are prompts to give your students to think about in a way that is less ideologic. And then here are some questions you can ask about that. You can do reflective listening before responding. So what am I hearing you say is this, right? So this is often when a student asks responds in a way that is possibly offending. You may want to ask for clarification, because what may seem offending is probably not. The student's probably not trying to offend anybody, hopefully. And this will get better details from them. What are the values or things that feel important to you about this, right? So here we are, obviously in the emotive way of asking questions, meaning based on emotions and empathy, where we're trying to dig deeper into the values of our students. And it may be that those values are not exactly like our values, but we are to recognize them and accept them in a way where we can work together. And hopefully those values are not discriminatory, because that would be a big problem. Talk about an experience that would help us understand why this is important to you, right? So something that may seem controversial, when explained in a way that is meaningful to the specific student, may give a context that we don't have, that may help us understand that person as a human being, right? It humanizes their experience even though their answers may not be exactly what we were thinking would be the best answer there. When you think about this, what's at stake for you, right? Again, we're applying whatever ideological situation is we're presenting to the students' experience, and hopefully that will allow us, by understanding the student and why they're answering the way they're answering, it will allow us to present different facts, or facts that directly address that in a way that makes more sense and helps everybody in the class understand each other better. Reflect on the place you have some agency, right? Meaning I can or I will. These are things that often apply to problems that we think that there's nothing we can do about, like some mass shooting or something like that, right? But if we ask the students to, again, apply it to themselves and think about what they can do, then we can get them out of some mood that feels incomprehensible and having an inability to do anything about it, into small things that they can do to improve their own mental health or health, well-being, or other such things. When, if ever, have you had a productive conversation about this, right? And this is a good question to ask when a student answers with some stock answer that is meant to engage us in a negative conversation that is ideologically based and is not productive, right? So you ask this kind of a question and you say, when have you ever had a productive conversation using this language or using this rhetoric, right? And the student's like, well, never, because it never happens. And then you can follow up and add to it and say, well, then let's think about the situation in a different way where, it can be a more meaningful conversation. All right, so reflections on class questions. This is towards the end of my presentation. Remember your pedagogical focus, right? Do your questions reflect your class objectives, right? So these are questions you need to ask yourself as you're preparing for your classes. How can you use your questions or conversations to examine in more detail a pertinent topic, right? What kinds of questions are you looking for? And depending on what kind of questions you craft, then you'll know what kind of answers you're going to get. You are not a robot, and neither are your students, obviously, right? It is okay to show some vulnerability and to honestly answer questions in ways that promote yours and other people's humanity. Oftentimes we think that it's all about just the numbers, the facts, the things, but oftentimes that's not really what will get your students engaged. What will get your students engaged is knowing that you don't just spout information that they may agree or disagree with, but that you are a person, and that at times you make mistakes, at times you have to change, at times you have to apologize, at times you grow. And as they see you modeling this form of humanity, then they will also engage in similar behaviors that you have set forth. Use your questions to connect with your students, all the while respecting their perspectives and values, right? And again, we have to know those perspectives and values if we are to engage with them. We can't simply assume that everybody agrees on, I don't know, human rights or something, or whatever it may be. We should be, right? We think that we should, but oftentimes that's not the case. So we need to probe, dig deeper, and find out about our students, so then our conversations match with their expectations and also with the classroom goals and expectations. Obviously, create a positive learning environment. This is the most important thing in order for your questions to be answered well and to have productive conversation. Provide enough time for students to respond to questions. Let students handle awkward silences. This is something that we hate as professors generally, and it is a skill that is very good to learn. Whenever you ask a question, specifically a more difficult question, just give them time. Just wait, don't talk, and let them answer. And oftentimes, this is when those students that usually don't answer will answer, because you've given them that time. You'll have the students that are so in with it that they'll answer every question immediately, and you can just say, Okay, Johnny, thank you for your answer. I see your hand. I would like to hear the answers from some of my other students, and then give them that space and wait. And it's a little awkward, but somebody usually will break that silence and you'll get to those other students that don't answer as much. You can call upon them. You can tell them things like, I am going to call upon some students, but I want everybody to think about this topic for the next 3 minutes. You may take notes and other things. And that way, they're not scared that you've called on them and they have nothing to answer because they're so frightened. But instead, you've told them, I am going to call randomly upon some of you, but here's time to think about. You can even tell, why don't you talk in pairs about this for a little bit? And then they know that something's going to happen. They could be called upon, so they prepare their answers ahead of time. Encourage student responses, even if they're wrong. If a student is wrong, inaccurate, or unclear, respond with probing questions such as, that is interesting, what makes you say that? Or could you rephrase that in a different way? Ask for students to respond to each other. This is a great way to kind of prep a classroom conversation by having them talk in small groups on a similar topic to get them thinking in the right way and to dig deeper. And then when you ask the question to the class, they will have already gone through some of the steps among the Bloom's taxonomy scale. And then when you get to the bigger questions, they are there with you. State the relevance of a student's response to the topic, or use a student's answer to your question as a link to some part of the topic framework in order to increase interaction and participation, right? Acknowledge your students, use their answers, and build with them as you move forward in the class to show that you care and that you value their answers. And as you do, obviously, they will want to answer more. All right, let me see what my time is. We have 6 minutes, I believe, and I have 4% of battery left, so we're still in good condition. Now, we probably won't be doing this right now. Had we done this in person, I would have given you more time. And I want you to think about your classes and what topics you teach. And can you think of any questions that you could use to achieve your class goals, right? Be detailed and write an open-ended funnel set of questions using any of the methods we looked over today that approach a subject of interest to you. So this would be 5 minutes. And then for the next portion, I wanted to hear your questions or sets of questions, and then we would get group feedback. We may want to do this at a different time, or if any of you think of any questions you would like to pose, this would be a perfect time before we end.
I have more of a comment than a question, I guess. I appreciated what you said earlier about maybe it being less important to get through the content in class and to keep in mind to utilize the asynchronous time. I had a big decade break from, I used to teach in the early 2000s, and then I had a decade off, and then I returned a couple of years ago. And so 15 years ago, we didn't have, the internet was not as ubiquitous, and it was not used as much in the classroom. And I mean, it was a little bit, but not a lot. And so at that time, when I had students look for things in the media, they were literally looking in a print media. It was very different time. And so I think that I need to retrain my brain to utilize that asynchronous time. I mean, I even have instructional videos that I've made for online courses that I teach. So maybe I start to utilize those in my regular courses as like, hey, watch this 5-minute or this 10-minute outside of class. And then in class, we're going to focus on practice and discussion, but I'm no longer going to be lecturing in class. I'm thinking about moving that way. It's a big overhaul. It'll be a lot of change, but I think that it could be really exciting. So
I agree. I'm going to say it in Spanish. Fantástico.
Yeah.
No, I think that is excellent, because really, right, what is class time about? It's about those things that are meaningful, that are most important, that you want your focus to focus your students. And that kind of road, like, let me tell you about Ser and Estar and whatever things that I teach. that's fine. And you may need to do some of that and then use closed-ended questions for comprehension checks or something. But then the rest of the class should be application analysis, thinking about critical thinking. So that's great. I hope you take the time. There are some grants that we do here at SMU where people can even get some help with the time they spent in restructuring their courses. So that may be something to ask and go from there. Yeah,
I already have all the content, I think, for my online version. It's just a matter of getting permission to use it and then adapting it. So
yeah, but Jessica, a lot of people feel overwhelmed by having to do that conversion. It's just understanding that you don't have to do the whole course, right? You can just pick and choose whichever topics that make more sense for you to get started.
Yes.
And once that works, you can just move on to the next thing as you implement it. So
good. Anybody else? Any comments or final?
Thanks, Constantine. I actually have to go pick up kids from school, but enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and I appreciate you being here.